Hi, I'm Dan Kubisky, co-chair of the International Community of the Society of Professional Journalists. The international community keeps track of press freedom issues and threats to journalists around the world. Unfortunately, those same threats we see in other countries are also growing in frequency in the United States. Despite all the constitutional and legal protections the media have in the United States, its ranking in press freedom in the world has dropped. Reporters Without Borders put the US at number 45 out of 180 countries surveyed. Last year, the US was at number 42. And remember, the lower the number, the better the ranking. So with that decline, we thought it would be useful to have a brief chat with a group dedicated to keeping an objective eye on the press freedom situation in the United States. With me today is Kirsten McCudden, managing editor for the Press Freedom Tracker. Numerous journalism groups, including the SPJ, partner with Press Freedom Tracker to provide reliable information on the number of press freedom violations in the states. Kirsten, thank you very much for being here.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me. And thanks to you and SPJ for partnering with the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. You're right that the tracker operates across with many partners, and that's so we can best identify and document press freedom aggressions to journalists in the U.S. That partnership is so important. So thank you.
Okay, well, you kind of took my thunder with the first question there, trying to explain Press Freedom Tracker. Could you just go into a little more detail about how you do it, how you do the work you do, and why you do the work you do?
Definitely. Sorry about that. So the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker is one project by Freedom of the Press Foundation. What it does is document. It's essentially, as you mentioned, an objective news database documenting press freedom violations across the U.S. And that can mean a lot of things. We track across 11 categories, specifically everything from assaults of journalists, so a physical attack, to an arrest. A journalist is doing their journalistic work that could be documenting, reporting at a protest or photographing in a public space. And if that journalist is arrested, we document it in the tracker. Also, attempt to count the number of subpoenas a journalist or news organizations receive. Each category gives you kind of a look at what's happening to journalism and free press across the US. So while you can dive into any one category at any point in the database, you can find out just how many journalists have been assaulted year over year. You can also take a step back and see where these assaults are happening, as an example, or when journalists are more likely to be subpoenaed for testimony. So it gives you, the tracker is able to give you both an individual report of an aggression, as well as really this overview of the state of press freedom in the US. It's a really important tool for all of us.
Now, I mentioned earlier there's a lot of constitutional and legal protections that reporters in the United States have that our colleagues in other countries don't have. Now, you talked about arrests and subpoenas against journalists. Are there other infractions that sidestep all these legal protections that that your organization or that all journalists should be concerned with?
One thing when you talk about legal protections, it does vary state by state. So if you're a journalist in the field, if you're you think about where your organization is placed, but also where you are doing the reporting, each state has varying levels of protection for journalists. There is no federal shield law for all journalists and for federal protection. So most states do offer a state shield law, which says that a journalist work product and a journalist has a layer of protection under the First Amendment, but there's no federal protection yet. The Press Act in Congress right now is looking to change that, and that's one part that FPF, Freedom of the Press Foundation, is actively advocating for, actively working to raise awareness of the Press Act, both for journalists and for the public, of how important a federal shield law would be in ensuring protections for journalists across the board.
Now, do you look at freedom of information acts on a state level? Because we have a case now in Arkansas where Governor Huckabee wants to, if not remove, at least severely weaken the FOIA provisions in that state. So does this come under the, do you keep an eye on legislation such as this, or do you let other organizations deal with that while you deal with other larger issues?
Yeah, good question. A little bit of both, actually. So when a lawsuit, for example, against a government or government actor from a journalist or news organization goes through the court system and accuses either a government agency or somebody working on behalf of not holding up sunshine laws, Freedom of Information Act requests, and the news organization wins that lawsuit, it is something that is documented in the tracker. FOIA, otherwise, FOIA backlogs, the length of time it can take to get a Freedom of Information request responded to, that's mostly tracked by other organizations. So a little bit of both.
Okay, fair enough. We're the international community. We look at a lot of issues around the world. In your work, do you see any similarity or connection between the threats journalists are facing in other countries and then the threats that journalists face in the US?
That's a great question. Think what those who track across international communities, Committee to Protect Journalists, another partner of the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, other groups, Reporters Without Borders, you mentioned the World Press Freedom Index. What we know is that large gatherings have always been dangerous places for journalists. In the U.S., we see that in the sense of protest. So when there is a social justice protest, we saw a lot of this in 2020 following the death of George Floyd. There were national protests in the U.S. That mirrors what we know across other countries. Large gatherings are often dangerous for journalists, both to be assaulted, certainly for arrest by law enforcement, sometimes by assaults by law enforcement, but also by private individuals who may or may not want to be associated with that public action.
Okay, well, we also have, unfortunately, growing individual threats against journalists. We have the case in Las Vegas of the journalist who was killed largely because of his reporting, and now the person under arrest, it was the target of that reporting. We've had our colleagues in Mexico point out that they're seeing similarities in the US that they saw in Mexico years ago in these threats. Would you care to comment about these death threats that are now coming to American journalists that, at least in my thinking, are unprecedented in the frequency that they're coming out in?
Yeah, super scary. Just recently, well, what you're referring to is the death of Jeff German in Las Vegas last year. A man is on trial, accused of his murder for his reporting, and that is incredibly scary certainly to journalists in the U.S. Also, Dylan Leons died in 2022, died last year of bullet wounds while reporting. So while it is not known that he was targeted as a journalist or not, death by gun violence is also something that we see internationally that is affecting journalists here in the US as well. Just recently, a reporter in New Hampshire Public Radio, both the reporter, Lauren Kulijan, and her editor, right, through last year, their homes and the homes of the reporters parents were vandalized. And just recently, 4 men were indicted on that vandalism that included death threats. We'll be back. This isn't the end. And the positive there is that there's been really strong law enforcement response. People have been arrested, and those charges are making their way through the legal system.
Right.
Same, same with
yeah,
Garmin. Yeah,
right.
as you were saying.
And also, I mean, I'm in Virginia, so just in the neighboring state of Maryland, we had that shooting at the Annapolis newspaper as well, where 5 of our colleagues were killed. Any last thoughts on the issue and on the importance of keeping track of press freedom in the United States?
Yeah, Dan, one thing that the US Press Freedom Tracker allows you, the public, to do is to put these press freedom aggressions, the death of a journalist, the journalist's home vandalized, into a larger context. And you and I both know how important it is to see both the individual story and the larger story that's happening here. The tracker's only existed since 2017. And when you're talking about, unprecedented threats, we can't measure through the database before 2017, but thankfully it grows it exists every year so that we can measure time over time. We don't want it to grow, of course. The data is added in there every year, and it really allows us to have these kind of thoughtful conversations of the state of press freedom. It informs advocacy. It also informs where the U.S. sits, such as Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index. The tracker is so important in all of these conversations. So you bringing light to it is really fantastic. Thank you. And do reach out to the tracker if you know a press freedom violation, and also if you want to know how to use it. It's a data visualization based database. You can download the data, you can play with the API for whatever research question or interest that you have. It's really there to serve the public. So these kind of spotlights on what it does are so important. So thank you, Dan.
I just want to put one plug in for a program we're doing in the international community. We're talking about threats to journalists as a threat to society. And we will be having the editor from the Las Vegas newspaper speaking with an editor from Mexico as they talk about the threats that their reporters have received, the murders of their reporters, and what it means on a larger in the larger picture for a democratic society. And I think you've made the point very clear that without good journalism, the society is in danger of falling apart in terms of the democratic principles and ideals.
That's going to be a great conversation at the SPJ convention coming up. I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks to SPJ for hosting it. Definitely.
Well, thank you very much for taking time from your schedule to be with us. Kirsten McCudden, managing editor of the Press Freedom Tracker.
Thanks, Dan.